And now, welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the Director of Communications at the Writers Center, and I'm also a novelist and fiction writer and writer of some other things as well. And that's why I get to have this conversation today. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dionne Irving to the Writers Center virtually and to celebrate the release of her new book, Quint, which is really, really excellent, and I've enjoyed it, and I'm really excited to talk about it today. But to get started, Dionne, if you have your book handy, could you read just a short excerpt so our guests who may not have read the book yet have a taste of what we'll be talking about?
I would love to. And thank you so much for having me, Zach. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about this book, which has been 10 years probably plus in the making. So I think you kind of mentioned in an earlier email a little bit about sort of the different narrative voices that are in the book. It has lots of different narrative perspectives. So I thought a section which is told from the point of view of one of the dead sisters in the book, and thinking about sort of her role as omniscient narrator to kind of give an example of that. So we'll read a section from her voice, and that'll give you an idea kind of her voice too in the novel. Eventually, they would just pretend to sleep. Who can sleep under hot, bright lights and with the cacophony made by the endless shuffle of bodies in the observation gallery? My sisters imagined you individually and then together as the throng you were as you watched them. They knew that fascinated, you watched them playing, making their beds and eating pancakes slathered with the B brand golden corn syrup that Reese Osborne wanted you to buy, even though everyone knows real Canadian babies only eat maple syrup, one of his lesser sins. As my sisters grew, they peered into that mirror more and more frequently and intently, and if they stared hard enough, they could conjure your faces, could feel your gaze. The glass was two-sided, but wasn't well soundproofed. They heard the coughs, the squeak of new patent leather shoes on, and you disciplining children on the other side of the glass. My sisters heard you every day, nearly all day. The disgusting hacks of those cold-ridden in the wintertime, the wet sneezes of those visitors not accustomed to the Northern Ontario wildflowers in the summer, and the whispers. You always seemed to be whispering. Those hushed voices would haunt my sisters. They could hear you when they were awake, when they were asleep. All of it, even the gasps of "my God" and "sweet Jesus" became white noise and then became nothing at all. My sisters heard when you were there and when you weren't. In some ways, the latter was worse. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I like that chapter too, so I'm glad you read it. Just in your own words real quick, who are you?
Well, I am a writer and a professor. I'm originally from Toronto, Ontario, which is where I grew up and first learned a little bit about the story of the quintuplets. But I've lived all over at this point. And I am just getting ready to start a new position at Notre Dame, where I'll be working in the creative writing program there, as well as in a new institute that Notre Dame has funded on race and resilience. So I'm really excited about getting the chance to do that work. I saw somebody put "Go Irish" in the chat, which is great.
I had seen that job posting come up, and I was so happy when I saw that. When I saw you were taking that must be the job that you were going for. So I was really pleased that was you. So you mentioned alternating points of view before you read that section, and that was really interesting for me, just because sometimes, like, I'm just interested in how alternating points of view work together is just a point of interest for me in general in fiction. And so I was wondering how do the alternating points of view in this novel relate to each other, sort of in terms of content, in theme and language and tone? And did you try to make any direct threads between each chapter and the adjacent chapters? Was that something you were trying to, what is, I guess, the logic between why one point of view is next to the other point of view?
Yeah, I didn't actually write the book chronologically, and in some ways in these kinds of sections. And then I had it out of chronology at different points and then put it back into chronology. And so I think that in some ways was a really good way to work with these different points of view, because it gave me the opportunity to not feel like I was, married to a certain point of view and needed to sort of sustain that voice for a really long period of time. Because I think that's a real danger, right? When you're writing with multiple points of view, that there is the danger of, switching into another voice after you've been in one voice for such a sustained amount of time. And for me, the sister voice came a little bit later in the process, but it's also the one that felt like it was really demanding to come out and really demanding to be heard. And that voice really came after doing some research as I was researching the story of the quintuplets. It was, something I found during my research and started thinking about. And then that voice really ended up coming to the forefront of the novel in a lot of ways, and ended up actually being a nice way to tie together some of these other disparate voices that were in the novel, that she is able to cast judgment on some of those voices, and she is able to make judgments about some of the things characters are doing that might not be, self-aware enough to think about or to see the consequences of.
Okay, and you mentioned the sister's perspective, and the sister was a very interesting point of view for me because it's first person omniscient. So we're sort of getting almost like an old school narrator who has a persona and a voice but also has access to basically everything. So unlimited access to inner thoughts and play and scenes and things they couldn't have otherwise been privy to. So first of all, just about, you also have chapters from a collective, a third person plural or first person plural, pardon me, we chapters for the town, which has a name I won't try to pronounce. And what does an unusual or non-traditional, I should say, instead of unusual, narrator allow you to do that? Maybe why did you go in that direction instead of just typical first person for those two types of those two parts in particular, or typical third person?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things, as I was thinking about sort of that idea of sort of shifting narrative perspectives as well, the Quints themselves have a very closed off life, right? They don't understand the world. It's hard for them to see the world. And if I was thinking about the story just from their perspective, there were going to be things that were going to happen to them that they wouldn't have a frame of reference to think about, right? And in some ways, this is also, the limit of the child narrator. One of the things that has to happen when you have a child narrator, for example, is they have to be a little bit precocious, right? Because they have the burden of narration on them. And, these girls were not necessarily going to be the most precocious characters, even though I feel like that did come up a little bit as I started to write my way into them. But they were so shielded and so protected and so cut off from the world that I think putting the entire narrative burden on them would have been difficult to sustain for the entire novel. As far as some of the other characters in the novel too, they do really bad things, right? And I felt like part of sort of navigating, what it means to take children away from their parents, what it means to give up your children, that those would be really hard decisions to understand unless we sort of understood what was going on for that character in a really intimate way. That it would be really easy to cast them, as villains, right?
So were there any difficulties in working in multiple point of views? Were there any particular challenges you found yourself facing, or things you had to maybe address during the revision process in particular, as you went through and worked with this perspective bouncing around? And these are pretty short chapters too. So it's not like 20 pages, then another perspective. It's sometimes less than a page, sometimes 2 or 3 pages. These chapters tend to be fairly short.
Absolutely. And I think that, I think sort of the old warhorse of creative writing is, write what you know, right? Write what you know, write what you know. These characters could not be any more different than me in terms of age and race and class. They're completely different for me in terms of characters. And so I think that that too is sort of a challenge in terms of thinking about putting yourself in the voice and the life of the experience of somebody who is so different than you. And for me, one of the things that the characters really share in this novel, both the parents, the children, their guardians, I think one thing that they all have in common, and the sister as well, is that they are all really cut off from their own emotions and also feel sort of othered in these various different spaces that they inhabit. And I think that's something all of these characters share. And so I think that was a really helpful way to think about how I was going to access each of these different voices, is that all of these people in many ways are really suffering and feeling excluded from whatever community that they're within or a part of. And so that for me was the access point to get into these different characters.
Great. And I guess I want to close out my point of view questions with like sort of a broad one, which is, what's the first piece of advice you would give to an author working on a draft of a story told with an experimental or non-traditional type narrator?
Yeah, I think you have to stay in the voice for a while, and I think you're right that my chapters are very, very short, but some of them were written, at the same time where I was staying with that particular narrative voice. For me, it would be really difficult to sort of move away from that voice completely. For example, the sections that are with Anthony Rhys Edwards, who is a major character in the book. I wrote most of those in the same kind of span of time because I needed to stay in that voice. And that voice is probably the one that is most different, or most removed maybe from my own. And so that was one of the hardest voices to tackle. And so I really had to kind of stay with that character and also he was the one who did some of the worst things in the book, right? And so I really needed to stay with that character so that I could try to understand why he had done those things, that I could try to understand where he was coming from, how he justified the things that he did to himself. And so I think that sort of digging in, into a particular point of view for a long time is one of the things that helped me sustain those different voices. I also think that, you don't have to write novels don't have to start at the beginning and you don't have to end at the end, right? You can figure out where those pieces are as you're going through the process. And like I said, this very much for me was a collage and a patchwork and, about putting different pieces in different places and moving them around.
I think too, I just want to mention that I think the adult voices were so interesting because they were complicated and flawed, and I mean, more than flawed is an understatement, but very compelling to follow along, that you got to see them. Alternating perspectives allowed you to see them in sort of a more neutral light, and then their own biases. You did a really good job of what you think you were saying you want to do, which is reveal the ways in which that led them and enabled them to act the way they did and maybe not see themselves as villains. So anyway. Right. Yeah. No,
I would say that probably each character in the story thinks they are the hero, right? I think they feel like they have been wronged. And I think that was really important to me because we do, right? We often think we're heroes of our own stories, right? But somebody else might tell that really differently.
Yeah, but I think you nailed that. So that's great. So to the chat window, and the first question is a great question. I don't know we can do it full justice. I feel like this is a conversation this is a panel discussion on this one subject, I think, but it's a really good question. I think we should at least touch on it. So could we please comment on the dominance of the MFA program and whether you think there is marginalization of writers who don't have one? So getting into some writing logistics here, writing world industry logistics. Do you have any thoughts on that off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some truth to that. I mean, I do feel like the MFA can be a kind of, credit card that gives you access to different kinds of things, networks of people, and different, opportunities and experiences. I think that there were things that I would have had a really hard time even knowing about if, I hadn't gone to graduate school. That doesn't mean I wouldn't have found them eventually, but it does sort of allow you access to those networks and those experiences more quickly. Does that mean that everybody that is in an MFA program is a better, stronger writer? No, I wouldn't say that that's the case, right? But I think one of the things that it does give you is an opportunity to be surrounded by people who are passionate about writing. I worked corporate jobs before I went back to graduate school, and had that experience as well. And for me, that was kind of the hard thing. I was really into reading and writing, and I was around a lot of people who weren't necessarily interested in those same things. But that doesn't mean that the MFA is the only pathway to becoming a writer, And one of the things I have often said to students, especially who don't want to go the MFA route, I say, go audit a class, at your local college, sit in on a class, ask the professor for advice, there's great books about writing out there, that I think have been so useful that I come back to. I mean, I have some books from undergrad that I got that I, come back to again and again. Making Shapely Fiction by Jerome Stern is, I can't tell you the number of times that I am trying to tackle a problem and I go to that book and he's just got some great, 3-line piece of advice that you're like, of course, this is what I should do, And so I feel like there's lots of ways to have a career writing and thinking about what that looks like. I don't think that I don't think publications in general are skewed towards finding writers that have MFAs. I know lots of writers who don't have MFAs who have wonderful writing careers. But if you are starting from scratch and you're not sure where to start, I understand why a lot of people go that route, because it's a lot of information, it's a lot of resources and a lot of tools. And the biggest tool for me that was the most, that was, always the big draw for me for graduate school was time. I couldn't figure out a way to sort of have the kind of time that I wanted to have writing and be able to concentrate on my writing in that amount of time. My husband always says, you have the best intentions and then the world gets in the way. So
I'll say too, I mean, you mentioned auditing a class. The Writer Center exists, and what we sort of do is offer a la carte workshops. And so instead of going into a full program, you take a workshop. Can be not necessarily the same as a semester-long workshop, though we have some more like that. And we're not the only game in town either. There's plenty. If you're looking for in the future times, if you're not from the DC area and are looking for an in-person place to do this, there are other writer centers in many other cities around the country. So, and now there's plenty of online options as well too. And I do want to say, because the question did mention marginalization of writers who don't have one, and I have to stop myself from overvaluing when I see a prestigious MFA program in a bio. That doesn't mean that person came out of that writing great stories. It just means they went to that place and did that. And one of my favorite DC area writers has no formal English writing training in her background. So I think we use it as shorthand for knows how to write, and that's not what it is. And I do think, yes, I do think there is marginalization. I do think we in the industry look at those 3 letters and then maybe also the institution attached to them and right. Probably make hasty decisions based on that when that's not what we should be doing. So you are correct in that assessment, I think, to some degree, though I think hopefully most of us who are in the industry are also working hard to overcome those biases.
And I should say too, I have an MA from, I was doing a very corporate job before I decided to do that. And for me, I ended up going to the program because I wanted to write, and it was, it was close, and that's where I started. And so for me, that was my entry into things. And I ended up doing a PhD because I wanted more time to write. But that was for me, I didn't go to graduate school thinking, I've got to get this degree or these letters. For me, it was, how can I find time to write what's the quickest way to do that.
Mm-hmm. So taking time to write, another question from the chat. You mentioned it took you 10 years to write the novel. What kept you going for such a long period of time? Did you get bored or want to move on to other projects along the way? Or what was that 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I started writing this as a short story. It's a story that I've been interested in for a really long time, and I started writing it when I was in graduate school. I worked on other stories and did a lot of other things in the meantime. Short stories really are the thing I fell in love with writing. I still love short stories. I have a short story collection coming out next year. So, I love stories, and I love the compactness of stories and all that you can do sort of in that small space. And so for me, it was, starting with sort of the beginning of this idea. And I kind of just kept coming back to it. I wrote sort of a much more condensed version of the story that was in my graduate thesis. That was, I don't know, I guess novella length, I don't know, maybe 90 pages. I wasn't sure that I would return to it. And I kind of was always haunted by it, and so kept coming back to it again and again. For me, one of the real turning points was in 2014. I took a research trip and went to Northern Ontario, and went to the house where the quintuplets were born. Saw, some artifacts, went and did some research in archives. And that for me kind of was a good push to get me back into the novel, because I had kind of been in a place where I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with these 90 pages I had, or what I wanted to do, or whether I even wanted to keep working on them. And so that was a huge jolt for me. That really was the thing that kind of helped me finish the novel. And then shortly thereafter, I became a mother, which was another thing that really was a good kind of help me. I think it helped me understand some of the ideas of motherhood, in a different way. And I think that also really added to my experience. I started off with kind of an interest in the curiosity about the story, and sort of slowly developed over time.
Great. So another practical question is, did you work with an editor? And I guess maybe I might expand that too. Did you work with an editor? Probably when you had going to the publisher, there was probably an editor involved. Did you have any editorial people beforehand, either formal editors or writing group friends or pals who gave you some passes of this manuscript earlier on?
Yeah, I have a couple of friends. I feel like everybody saw this book. Everybody read a little bit of this book as because it was such a long process. My husband, who is my very first reader, has read 8 million versions of this novel and been very patient with each version that he's read. My in-laws read an early version of the novel, and they told me it was good. And so that was really, really good. I had 2 friends I was in a writing group with. And again, if you think about sort of, the long game of novels, I was in a writing group with 2 other great writers. And they both, in the time we were in the writing group, finished and published their novels. And I was like, not done yet. So, so I feel like it had a lot of different eyes on it. But I didn't hire an outside editor. I had an editor once I got to, once the publisher took it. And she was wonderful to work with. She had a couple of different places for me to flesh the novel out, or flesh the novel out in a couple of different places. But it was, by the time it got, it really mostly there.
Right. I think someone was asking the name of the book, Making Shapely Fiction, and the author of I've read the book and I can't remember who's the author of Making Shapely Fiction. Okay. Thank you.
It's a wonderful book. Highly recommend it.
Yep. Someone already put that in there. I didn't scroll down far enough. So it's been answered in the chat. So you mentioned that you don't have to start at the beginning or end at the end as a writing process. Those aren't the places you have to write. And someone, I think, wanted some expansion of that. Can you say more about not starting at the beginning and not ending at the end? How do you decide what the first and last line should be as a second part of that question?
Yeah, that's for me, that's always voice. It's what's the voice that's compelling me? What's the thing that draws me to a novel? I love the first line, of Morrison's Paradise, right? Which is they shoot the white girl first. And it's such a great line. And Morrison's talked about, how that line kind of came to her. And that was the thing that sort of pushed her into writing that novel. And it's not always your first line, but I always feel like there is something that there's a line or an idea or a voice that's the thing that brings me into the novel. It doesn't always end up as the very first line, right? But I feel like that's the thing you have to go with. It's that voice and that energy that's going to push you forward and sustain the momentum. In terms of figuring out where the end is, I feel like that's such a weird thing, right? It feels like that's something I can't even teach to students, right? I've had students ask me this question so many times over the years. Well, how do you know when it's done? And how do you know when you got to the end? And I feel like this is where I get really mystical about creative writing. I'm like, sometimes you just know, you get to that point and you feel it. You feel like it's the ending. I know that's like not the answer people want to hear sometimes, but I always compare it to like playing the piano or something like that. Like, when it sounds right? When you are able to play a song and it sounds the way that it should, I feel like that's part of artistic practice, that you do something long enough and you do it over and over again, and you understand the rhythms of it, and you understand, okay, this is the end of this book, or this story is finished, or, I've gotten to a place where I can stop. But I feel like that's just kind of something that comes with time and with practice.
I'll say too, whenever I'm working on something, very often I know the ending long before I get there. Like, I don't know it at the beginning, but some point in the middle of writing, I will enter. Oh, here's the end. And end up writing the end because I realize in the middle of a process, this seems like where it's going. And so sometimes a last chapter or a last few paragraphs will end up just sitting at the bottom of a document long before I've actually reached the point of time where I would be at the bottom of the document. Absolutely.
That you're writing towards that thing. Yeah. I've had both happen. I've had both, like, wandering in the dark where I'm like, I don't know where the ending is. Sometimes I know my new novel that I'm working on, like, I know I've written the last 3 paragraphs already. They're done. I wrote them 3 years ago. I will get there eventually, but they're there. And I know that they are the last paragraphs of that book.
And then I know too, we did a previous craft chat with the poet Shayla Sabri, and we included some of these quotes in our magazine. And one of the things she was talking about was when she sold her book, all she had was the beginning and the end, and she knew she wanted to connect. So she was working towards the middle. And so, like, that scares me a little bit, but
Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying.
So I did want to hit on this before going back, a couple of my questions before returning to the chat. And I called your book, I wrote a book that was sort of an alternate history. And I think yours is maybe a little truer to the history, but I also feel it's not quite historical fiction. I mean, starting with the fact that the names have been changed from the original quintuplets and characters. First of all, was that a deliberate choice to distance yourself from historical fiction about this subject?
I feel like it was a practical choice because my name is Dionne and they're the Dionne quintuplets. I felt like that was actually a really good thing for me to have to wrangle with right away as a writer, because it would have looked a little nuts, I think, to have my name on the book with the characters that had my same name. So that was actually, that was kind of a good exercise for me, because I was like, I have to start thinking about these girls not as just who they were, in life, right? I had to start to think about them as separate characters. And I think for me, that was a really, really good choice just to make as a writer, because it allowed me to sort of enter the story as a fiction. And I think that was really important. So there are some details, from their lives that are really a part of the book, but the trajectory of the story and many of the details of the story are quite different. And so, I like that idea of sort of working with, and like you said, your novel does it really well as well. Starting with these ideas, these historical ideas, as a way to kind of get into a piece.
And for me, the phrase I used was I was researching for inspiration rather than facts. Not saying I didn't grab a fact here and there, but I just wanted to this is a fertile subject to imagine within. The concept of these of the quints basically they were actually placed as the center of a theme park.
Absolutely.
And that's like, I want to write about it now, and I can't because you've already done it. But anyway, so what was your research like for this project? 'Cause I'm interested in research for fiction. You said you did a trip up there at some point, so you've actually done a research trip, so to speak. But how did you come across this subject, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain. I feel like it's one of those things that all Canadians know. It's like, hockey is important, and about the Dionne quintuplets, and donuts at Tim Hortons are objectively better than anywhere else, and those things are just sort of fact, as you grow up in Canada. So I can't even remember sort of, when I heard this story first. I feel like it's just kind of something that was always in the ether of my childhood. But I also think that, people who are, a generation or more older probably know a lot about the story because it was such a famous story at the time. It was the kind of thing where they were everywhere. They were on products. They were very much a part of the larger popular culture. And that was kind of the interesting thing as I started doing some of this research, especially at the time. They were everywhere, right? Newspapers, magazines, movies. There was so much where they would turn up, even being referenced in other movies from that era. You see sort of little mentions of them. So it is, they were kind of like, I don't know, the Kardashians of their day or something like that, that even if you didn't, think a lot about them, their name was in the ether and you would have heard it. And so that idea for me was really interesting in terms of thinking also about, the idea of celebrity, right? That something feels so essential and embedded in the culture, but, a generation or two goes by and it's washed away. It's not necessarily a thing anymore. And we feel sometimes, I think, that whatever is popular or famous now will be the thing that is in the historical record, right? But who knows, right? What survives of history, right? Or what makes it through or what passes through. There's no way to determine what that will be. And so that idea was really interesting. The museum, which was in North Bay, Ontario, had been a really popular, tourist destination for a while to sort of come and see the house where they were born and the bed and the incubator. But it actually closed down about a year after I went there. There's now, been some historical preservation where they actually have moved it to, they've taken the house and moved it to another site, and they're kind of starting to do some appointment visits. And there's a foundation to raise money to keep the House Museum funded, but it's not something people necessarily even know a lot about anymore, right? That it's sort of some bit of trivia, that people have hung on to, and not necessarily the kind of attraction where people would want to sort of come and see that anymore, which again, it's huge. When I started doing some research, it was during the Depression, and, one of the biggest things that added to the Canadian economy during that time was the quintuple. I should mention that you include some archival material in here. And I don't know if it's all 100% legitimate archival. Some of it seems like it is, but there's some advertising copy. And I love the advertising copy from that era. I feel like we need to go back to Depression era and World War II era advertising copy because it's phenomenal. And it's so scary, isn't it? It's like a little story in and of itself.
And also it's so manipulative, and also with better understanding of product and history of industry. You're just oh my gosh. This is when we're selling radioactive material, a step beyond selling radioactive materials to people as household goods. But yeah.
Absolutely. And that part it was so, I wrote many of those things, but it was, I just, I read a lot of them, and it was so much, the tangential leaps, that were made to like attach Quints to the products, it was a great fiction in and of itself. It was like, they were used to sell cars. They couldn't drive, and all kinds of things, and so that was really kind of fun to do, to think about how to include some of that archival material. And I felt like I wanted to capture as well in the novel, like some of the spirit of, what was going on around them, and how much this was a part of the culture, that there were, constantly articles in the newspaper, there was newsreel, there was, that it was so much a part of the culture. And I felt like the archival stuff did that in a way that was going to really reinforce these narrative voices, which sometimes were, extremely interior, and sometimes, not necessarily looking at the outside world. That those archival pieces to me felt like they created a really good juxtaposition against the narratives of the characters, to create, that kind of tension that was going to help us see how those two stories were sort of taking place simultaneously, the very external story and then the internal lives of these characters.
All right. So going back to the chat window, we have a writing world question again. What are your thoughts about entering writing contests? Is it worth one's time?
Yes. I will say one of my first publications was from a writing contest, and it can get expensive. I think you want to be selective. I always say, look at who's judging, right? Look at think about whether or not your work would be in line with their work and their ideas, and that would be something that they might like. So I wouldn't say enter contests willy-nilly, because that really can get quite expensive. But I think if you find there's somebody who's judging a contest that you feel like would be really in line with your work, I think those are good contests to enter. Also, having worked at a literary journal, the slush pile is a real and hard thing, and oftentimes the people who are reading the slush pile are going to be, interns or graduate students, and that they kind of have to go through those things really, really quickly. And so if there's not something like really compelling on the first page of your story, which there might not be, because some stories take a while to get going. I have a lot of stories that are written like that. It's not necessarily, that great first line that catches you, that you might not make it through. And it doesn't mean that your piece isn't good. It just might be a quieter or a slower piece to get going on. And so I feel like contests are a great way to get eyes on a story, right? That your work is going to be read and looked at and thoughtfully considered. So I wouldn't say just willy-nilly enter contests, but, be selective, find journals that you like, find editors that you like, and think about how you enter those contests.
And I'll say to it, I think it depends a little. My first book won a contest, and that's why it was published. And it's a story collection, and story collections are often much harder to place. Unless there's a novel behind it, most major publishers are not going to care as much about a story collection. So that was the only option I really had. I wasn't going to find an agent for that story collection without something behind it. And so I entered the contest, and I probably paid way more money than I'd like to admit entering those contests, but eventually it did find a home. So there is potential there. I think, Don, you may have also had a question about short stories in general, and maybe we'll get back to that one if there's time. But
well, I should say too, I have a friend who entered a contest with her short story collection, and it was going to win. And there was an agent who had read it who said, "Pull your collection from the contest. I'll get you a better deal," and did. So
yeah. That is a dream.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a difficult question, and I like it. So we're going to go to it. Is how do you make the story compelling? How do you make it a page turner? And I definitely wanted to ask that one, because I think your book is really compelling and is a page turner, despite not being a thriller by any means, I don't think.
Gosh, that's a great question, and I don't have a good answer. I think that I don't know. I mean, I think that, you know, for me, and I think this is probably old advice, but in some ways that you can't think about, you know, a reader too much when you're engaged in that process of writing. I think you have to kind of tell the story as you want to tell it. Think about how you are going to go forward and keep the momentum of storytelling. I think some of those concerns in some ways are editorial ones, because I think that, you know, your editor kind of has to say to you, yes, this has a lot of energy or momentum. But for me, it was about, you know, keeping going with the story, and how do I sustain that momentum and staying interested with the story that I want to tell. And I'm glad to hear it's a page turner. It's interesting to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's interesting to anyone else. So,
you know, I'm thinking too is, so I think I'm pointing at the green book on the shelf. I'm assuming that's Lydia Davis's essays, essays 1, and she, she's not the first person I've heard say this, but it's the one time it stuck with me. I heard it enough times, and her saying it was, you know, new sentences should reveal new information. And I think you're really good about not backtracking, and, you know, there's constantly this forward progress of new information. I think that may be one of the things that make sure you're not repeating stuff that you've already been told. You need some reinforcement. Our memories aren't good enough without some reinforcement, but like, everything you present should offer something new. And maybe that's really what page turning is just the reader trusting the author to regularly provide new information on subsequent pages. You keep turning those pages and going forward. And I think that's something I'm getting from your book now too. And that's fresh in my head from reading the essay collection by Lydia Davis. So
I think that's just excellent advice. I would say that's something I see in students describe, for example, like a gesture, or they'll show a gesture, right? And then tell us what that gesture meant. And I'm like, but we understand, right? We got it, you showed it to us, and I understand that completely. So, you know, a smile came across her face that she was happy. And I was like, I understood that though from the gesture. And so I think that is really, I hadn't sort of thought about that as being a quality of page turning, but I think that is excellent advice.
Mm-hmm. So another question from the chat: do you establish protagonist, antagonist character profiles before you dive into writing? And do you find it hard to stay true to the integrity of the characters as the writing evolves?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think that really goes back to what I said a little bit earlier about empathy. So I really do try not to think about this idea of like protagonist and antagonist, but thinking a little bit about who each of these characters is. And I think that's actually, to me, the most important tool that we can exercise as writers is empathy. That we do have characters all the time who do horrible things, right? And even if we don't expect the reader to feel empathetic for them, we have to write them with empathy. And I think that again moves us away from, you know, this idea of the sort of flat character, right? That character is really one note, right? If somebody is just unilaterally evil, it's hard to buy them, right? It's hard to believe them as a person, you know? It doesn't mean that they aren't a really horrible person. But, you know, people do all kinds of things all the time, right? Good people do bad things, right? Bad people occasionally do good things, right? And we, you know, it's always good to think about the fact, like, you know, maybe that person had a mother that loved them, right? Or a sister that they cared about, right? And even if that's not in the story, I think keeping that sort of in our minds as we are writing, you know, where is this person's humanity, right? How does that then translate to how we write them, right? I think if we think about it that way, it doesn't change the things they do. It doesn't even mean that the reader will necessarily read them that way, right? But our understanding of them as a more complex human being, actually, and having some empathy or thinking about their humanity, I think is a really, really important thing to do as a writer, and a really important technique to employ as we think about how we're going to write people who are horrible or bad or complicated. And, again, thinking about the idea that they are probably the hero of their own story, right? That they don't think they're a bad person. Many of us do not think we are bad people, right? Whether that's true or not is quite another thing. But, I think that keeping that in mind is a really important thing.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I had a question on my questions that goes back to the previous questions about forward motion and keeping the pages turning. And I think you as a writer sort of have the opposite ratio of scene to exposition. I think you tend to write you write exposition really, really well. And you're covering in about 300 pages, I mean, 2 decades, basically, by the time this is all said and done. And so obviously that requires going through big chunks. And if I had done this, and this is not saying I'm right, I would have been scared about those big chunks of time. I would have been terrified of them. So I would have written some scenes and let the jumps happen. You carry us through those jumps, not all of them. We don't get every single detail from the full 20 years, but you do really great exposition. And I don't have a great idea of how you do that yet. So I'm going to ask about it. What makes exposition interesting rather than explaining? Because yours is I'm always interested, and maybe it's the facts, new information, but what in your mind is making exposition interesting?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to talk about, because I think with thinking about my background as a short story writer, I love scenes, right? It's where I want to sit a lot of the time. And I think part of thinking about covering time in this novel sort of made me think about sort of how I had to employ exposition a little bit more as a tool. But I also think in some ways short stories are very good training for that, because you have to do so much in exposition in a short story, because you don't necessarily have a ton of it, right? We have to get to those moments of heat and intensity in a short story that are going to allow us to sit in that scene and understand why that scene is really important. So for me, actually, taking that skill that I was thinking about in terms of exposition in a short story and applying it to sort of a longer form was one way to think about doing it. I think one thing that's really wonderful about longer works too is that you can sit in a moment and unfold a moment or a scene or a time in a long way. But I will also say I've had a chance to sort of really dig into a lot more reading during this pandemic, and one thing I've really noticed that's kind of interesting about some novels, especially I think because we're in the era of the really big book, is that I sometimes have read scenes where I'm like, I think this went on a beat too long, right? I really wanted this to be a little bit tighter as a scene, and I think for me it's like, I guess for me, I always go back to mystery, right? I mean, I think that that's something I like. I always think about, the O'Connor book, Mystery and Manners, by Flannery O'Connor, which is another great writing book that I would recommend. And that's, part of her thing is about this act of writing, right, as a kind of engaging in a little bit of a mystery. And I think that that's something for me that's really central, that I think that I want to dig into the characters' emotions. I want us to see their lived experience. I want us to understand their interior lives. But I also want a little bit of mystery. I don't want that kind of over explaining. And especially thinking about, I spend a lot of time reading children's literature these days to my son. And so one of the things that I have thought about too, in terms of thinking about what's that line between, YA and adult fiction, because I think there's some, YA books that are really YA, adult fiction in YA clothing, right? That they're very much, and I have a good friend who writes them, and she's like, if there's young characters, they say it's YA now, right? Anything with a character of a certain age is YA. But I also think with some of the sort of more poorly written ones that I have seen, that's part of the issue, right? That it's like they want to, there's maybe not the emotional understanding that a child would have of a certain situation or a moment, right? So the book has to help them fill in that gap a little bit. But I also think kind of the idea of being an adult reader, right, is that, when you come to a work, part of that is not that you've had to have had this experience, but you understand shame or hurt or frustration or guilt, right? And part of the idea of like engaging in the act of reading and understanding humanity, right, is that we bring those experiences to the author and to the book. And, and I think that's, one of the things that can make that experience really pleasurable. I've heard some people say, oh, I can't watch The Office, right, because it's too cringy and like I feel awkward and embarrassed. And I love that. That's such a great way to think about it, right? Because there's nothing in there that's really horrible, right? But what it is like this residual embarrassment that we feel, and we're bringing that to like, to that show and putting that on the show, and we're feeling that feeling, right? Because it's a feeling that we've felt before. And so to me, that's where I sort of want that kind of holding back sometimes in a piece, and that desire. And again, I've been reading a lot of YA lately, but my son and I have been reading a lot of Roald Dahl during the pandemic. And one of the things I kind of like about him as a writer is that he has these great kid characters who kind of like say these things, and he sort of trusts the idea that you're a child, you know what it means when somebody feels mean to you. And if they said that thing, you're going to feel sad, or you're going to feel upset, or you're going to feel frustrated. And he doesn't do that thing where he kind of explains like, this is what somebody said or did to a child, and so they felt this way. It's very, in that way, his fiction sort of reminds me of adult fiction. He lets the child put sort of those feelings into whatever that character is experiencing in that moment, and they get it, right? My son reads this and he's like, yes, I'm angry or whatever. And that's, it's not on the page, but he understands as a human what that means.
I mean, I think you have to leave room for the writer, or for the reader, pardon me. The reader is part of the process. And if you don't leave enough room for them, they can't actually have they don't experience it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's how leaving room is how you give the reader an experience. So I think, absolutely. Okay, I'm thinking on all your things you just said now, though, and I'm going to go read more YA now. Back to the chat. Some of my most beloved novels are ones that the ending comes full circle and ties up the loose ends that keep you going through the story. On the other end of the spectrum are stories with open-ended finishes, leaving it up to the reader. Leaving it up to the reader. Do you have any thoughts on this, as which is more appealing to the masses or public for selling a novel? I mean, I can jump in and say, for selling a novel, tying up loose ends is usually a lot easier to sell to an agent and a publisher. But that is purely industry and non-artistic statement I just made.
I think you are so right. I think that there is a desire to tie up loose ends. I think the ambiguity of the short story ending is not necessarily valued in the novel. I also think, I will say, from having had this book sent around to lots of different places, I heard the same thing from a lot of editors, which was the ending's too sad. Like, there's no redemption. And I was like, there isn't sometimes, for me, that was absolutely part of the story. But that was very much a criticism of the book when it went around, that like, there's no redemption at the end, or there's no, people aren't punished, or like, in the way that they should be. And for me, that's life. Often people are not. And I think that I think there isn't, in the publishing industry at least, I think even if it's not a desire for like a happy ending, there still is, I think, some desire for the kind of, rights and wrongs, like, the bad person is punished or not rewarded, and good triumphs over evil, which, in some ways feels like a oversimplification of things. And the things I like the most about books and reading are complicated endings, right? Endings in which I have to think about that and sit with that as something that happens in the world, right? Because the world is a complicated place, and the world is a place full of contradictions. And so I want that from my reading as well. But I hear that from students all the time, well, this ending was too depressing, or the story was too sad. That for me does not discount a piece of fiction and actually makes me like it a lot. So, I am reading The Cape Doctor by E.J. Levy right now, which is absolutely gorgeous. And I highly recommend. But she gives away the ending pretty early on in the book. She also has a narrator who is dead. And so they are not omniscient, but, they're pretty clear in telling you that, there's going to be an end of their life, and they sort of look ahead to that. That doesn't mean the novel isn't extremely engaging. I mean, I am feeling that sort of page turning quality, even though I know, and it's historical fiction as well, know that the character is going to die, right? I still want to see what that story is and where we get there, even though the ending is going to be sad, because we've been given that already from the narrator.
Yeah. My love of anticlimax has made so many enemies in readers. I love an anticlimax.
I do
up and not fulfill the expectations. That's what I want to do with all my writing.
Absolutely.
Well, we have time for one more question, and so I will go to the last question, which is, what's one piece of writing advice you'd give to someone working on their first novel?
Keep writing. I think it's really easy to get away from it. I think that writing is hard work, I mean, I don't know a better way to say it other than that, after I had my son, I didn't write anything for about a year and a half. And I was really, really worried I was not going to be able to come back to it, that I had just let it sit too fallow. And then I came back and started writing a lot. But, I think that keeping going. And this is advice I will say I don't always follow myself, but people will tell you got to write every day. You got to sit at your computer every day. And I think that idea of regularity is important, but I also think find the time when you have the time. I think that for me has been huge. I went back to probably in the past 3 years, I've gone back to handwriting a little bit. I had sort of really trained myself in college to, everything was on the computer. And I've actually just started keeping a notebook on me and handwriting. And I have to tell you, I mean, part of that's just, changing our practice. That has been life-changing for me. Because it's like, I'm at the doctor's office and I have to wait a long time, and I have my notebook. So I write a few pages, and that idea of not having to be in front of my computer and doing that has been really, really, really good for me, where I was very much like, no, I don't handwrite. It takes too long. Then I have to transcribe it. I've actually gone the other way, and that for me has really revitalized my practice and just really gotten me to write more, because I didn't have to find the time to sit in front of my computer and do it. And I've been able to do that. And actually, the other nice thing I will say about that is when I come back to the computer, I'm never starting from scratch, right? I've got this notebook, with scenes and moments and lines and things in it like that. And that's sometimes a really good starting place for me, especially if, you feel blocked or you're having trouble getting started, and I don't remember who gave me this advice years ago, but it was like always, stop mid-sentence when you're writing, so that when you come back to it, right, you're not coming back to and feeling like you have to start a new paragraph or a new sentence. And for me, I can't quite do that because I'm a little crazy about that, but I feel like the notebook is kind of a good thing for that for me, so that even if I'm coming to it, I don't know where to start. I've got this notebook full of all kinds of weird little things. And I was just writing a story recently for my new collection, and I was kind of stuck on something, and I went back to a notebook and found something I wrote in a train station in Italy 3 years ago, and I was like, this is perfect. This is exactly what I need for the story, this scene. And I didn't even remember I'd written it. It was like, and it was great. And I put it in almost word for word as I had written it. And so I think that like I said, that practice for me has been really rejuvenative in terms of coming back to thinking about coming to writing regularly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dionne. Everyone, please buy the wonderful novel Quint. It is available at your local bookseller at the link at bookshop.org that we just put back in the chat window. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great chat. I think everyone had a great time. I know I did, and that's all I care about. So greed is in my favor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.